It takes a few minutes, and then if you want, you can also share it from my wall.
Sure. Do you want me to or begin with background of how I discovered astrology, or no?
Yes, I will ask you some questions about you, and then it will take us wherever it's supposed to, as it always does.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. It has been, so weird messages coming from all around. So I'm really curious to see what the stars are saying about that. I'm pretty sure they have a lot of...
Oh, I lost you for a second. You feel like they have a lot of things to say right now?
There's a lot of messages that are coming in. So I'm curious what the stars are saying about that.
Yes, yes.
Let's see. I'm trying to connect. It takes a bit of
sure.
broadband connection for that to happen. How is the situation there?
COVID?
Yeah, in general, like San Francisco, yeah.
It's good. It's good. We have had really low cases throughout. Right now, Omicron is really blowing up, but our hospitalization is flat. So I think, honestly, it feels like this may be towards the end. It's hard to get hopes up, but it does kind of feel like, because Omicron is so less lethal, that it's just going to be like more like a common cold kind of situation, which coronaviruses are the common cold, so it may just be the case that, like, when the new common cold ever emerged, this is what it did. It was kind of pandemic. We had no idea, and then we get used to it and it becomes the common cold.
It's possible. The common cold is still going on after so many years, so it's like it's pretty persistent. We just don't mind so much anymore.
What's that?
We just don't care so much anymore because it's like normal, but otherwise it's pretty...
Yeah, good point.
Let me see. I should be able to see it on my page, and then I'll share it with the warriors. See if I can see us. Yes, there we are. So I'm just gonna share it into the warriors. If you want to share it also in your page so people can see it live. Otherwise, you can also share it after, however it feels better.
Yeah, I'll probably just wait, I think.
Wonderful.
Too complicated right now.
I know. Don't worry about it. I'm just trying to see. Okay, perfect. So welcome. Yeah, it's so good actually to have this call today. So cool. It's
Likewise.
been some years we haven't seen each other personally, but you're always there, and I always remember the theories that you have been telling me back then. But let's take it from the beginning. I always start with a question that sometimes is a little bit tricky, but I really love this question. And that's it, like, who is Chad Harris? And who is the person that is in front of me right now?
Oh, yeah. Start with the real tough one.
You know me.
Yeah, I like it, though. It's the grounding. It is where we should begin. So because we're approaching the conversation of spirituality, I will begin by saying that I was raised agnostically. My parents were raised Methodist, and they basically adopted the scientific perspective. My mom still held faith in ways, held faith, but we never went to church. It was never part of my upbringing in the sense of this is something you should know about. So my sister and I were on our own to figure out what we believed. And so that was my origin. And so I approached life mostly through a logical kind of scientific method in essence. And I was disenchanted with high school in many ways. I grew up in Florida, in Tallahassee, Florida. And I was extremely lucky to have encountered psychedelic mushrooms when I was 16 years old. They grew in the fields there in Tallahassee, and I went and retrieved them myself and imbibed myself and had really profound experiences. I guess the very first experience, actually, I was driving down the road, going to pick up my sister from the mall, and I was looking at the clouds, and I had this gnosis, a direct insight that all of life on Earth as we know it is balanced in the amount of cloud cover we have. If there's not enough clouds, life doesn't happen. If there's too many, life doesn't happen. It's extremely rare, in a sense, that we can tell in the universe, balance that affords this capacity for life to flourish in the way that it does. And so I had this experience. It was so profound in that moment that it shifted my awareness. And I ended up basically becoming more disenchanted with high school and ended up not graduating at the end, and pulled out. Was going to a lot of Grateful Dead shows and doing my own inner journeys, and came to a search for meaning. And I looked at the religions. I was interested in many. I kind of resolved towards Buddhism, but ended up seeing all of them as patriarchal, all of them as having shadow. Nothing spoke to me with any genuine authenticity, until I had my second MDMA experience. And it was a simple conversation with a friend of a friend who was very interested in astrology. And I had looked at the sun sign paper stuff, and again, was disenchanted, or not impressed with it, in the sense of, how could this be 1/12 of the population their day? How could this match up? And it was just like, that's just not the way it works. And but then this conversation, when I was in this like heightened state of awareness, simple descriptions of the signs of people that I was really familiar with, my mother and my father and my girlfriend, I had this clarity of insight. It's the best way to describe it. Is just I could see the archetypes. I could see them manifesting in the character of my close and intimate friends. And I was completely blown away, jaw dropped. I left the conversation literally with my jaw hanging, like why didn't I see it before? That it was such a profound shift. It was like, wow, And so the very next day I went to the bookstore, the metaphysical bookstore, got my chart done. I didn't even know what a chart was, a natal chart, and got books and just started reading. And I got a reading, started looking at all my friends and family's charts, and continue to be astonished and blown away today. This was in October of 1995. So wow. I've been pursuing this quest since that time. And then specifically what happened was, about 2 years later, I was really impressed. What I recognized was, relative to my natal chart and the transits of that night, like where the planets were in the sky on the evening that I had this insight, I was very struck by the fact that the planet Mercury, which corresponds to the mind, the way one thinks and conceptualizes information, was in exactly the same place as Uranus was when I was born, which Uranus correlates to novel insights, electric epiphanic breakthroughs potentially. I mean, it's also many other things. But I was struck by that. And I attended a lecture by Rick Doblin, who's the head of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies today. He's involved in the legalization push for MDMA and psychedelics and therapy. And he was describing psychedelics, and I approached him after the lecture and I said, I'm deeply interested in the connection between psychedelics and astrology. And he said, Stan Grof, and I think his name is Richard Tarnis. They do research in that area. And I was just like, what? People do research on psychedelics and astrology? I was blown away by that. And I got Rick's number off of CIS's website, the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he's a professor here in San Francisco. And I called him and I told him who I was and what happened to me on that day when I was born and the transits that I saw. And I just asked him, does this make sense to you? And he called me back like 5 days later and said, yes, actually, it's kind of classic for the sudden unexpected breakthrough or mental awakening, the Mercury and Uranus. But then he pointed out that Uranus in the sky was also 90 degrees from my natal Mercury. So that's a 3-year transit, whereas Mercury is much faster. It's a few days that it crossed my natal Uranus, whereas Uranus was making a 3-year transit to my natal Mercury. So for the next 3 years, I was, electrified by more Uranian energy relative to my mind, to Mercury. And I, went deep into my studies. But he also said that I could come and audit classes here in San Francisco at the California Institute of Integral Studies, where he's a professor. So I bought a van, drove to California and couch surfed and took the 2 first courses in the spring of 2000. Ended up coming back in 2003, and I've lived here since. I've been studying with him, and I guess that's the basics of the story. I guess I should say here that that the astrological perspective, the archetypal astrological perspective that Richard Tarnis has developed, it emerged out of Stanislav Grof's psychedelic therapy, out of his psychedelic research. So Stan Grof he's the world's leading pioneering LSD researcher. He's from Prague, Czechoslovakia, and he led the last legally funded LSD research here in the United States from 1968 to 1971 at Johns Hopkins Medical Institute. And he ended up coming to Esalen when psychedelics were made completely illegal and no studies were allowed in 1971 and 72. And he moved to Esalen, and then Richard Tarnis graduated Harvard at the same time, and he moved to Esalen as well to study with Stan. So they're doing their research. Richard Tarnis actually wrote his doctoral dissertation on LSD psychotherapy. And so they're doing their research on LSD psychotherapy, and they're trying to understand why a person would have a particular experience on one day and have a completely different experience 2 weeks later, or why 2 people on the same day with the same dosage of the same substance would have completely different experiences. Why one could be a blissful state of enlightenment and the other could be a hellish experience of contraction and fear and isolation, in the sense of actual death, psychological death, or it seems as though it's literal death in the experience. But why would have these 2 radically different types of experiences? And none of the psychological tests that they had at the time would give them any insight. And until an astrologer was passing through Esalen and suggested that they look at transit astrology in particular to see if it matched the quality of their experiences. And lo and behold, it matches it beyond their wildest dreams. They were completely astonished by it. It wasn't something they were looking for. They were slightly dismayed in a certain way, because they're in the project of trying to make psychedelics more appealing and palatable to
and try to put the archetypal astrology there.
Yes, exactly. And but it turns out it works, and it compelled them to continue the deepening their research. And what the brilliance here, and this is where it kind of all pivots, is in Richard Tarnis's work, where because he was a historian and his Harvard graduate historian, he was able to apply his understanding, his insights into the archetypal dimension of the outer planets relative to cultural history. And he's written 2 books. One's called Passion of the Western Mind, which is an intellectual history of Western thought. It's just from Plato to the postmodern in the way that we've conceptualized archetypes and negotiated our relationship to that understanding from ancient Greece to the postmodern. And basically that book was supposed to be the first 3 chapters of Cosmos and Psyche, which wasn't, Passion of the Western Mind was released in 1990, 89, 90, and Cosmos and Psyche wasn't completed and finished until 2006. And so Passion of the Western Mind is used in many universities, like 100 universities, as a history text by many people who have no idea he's an astrologer. And it's a well-received intellectual history of Western thought. And now what the astrological perspective seems to indicate is that there's some form of reconnection back to the archetypes in a genuine and authentic way that can shift our understanding ultimately of who we are and the nature of the cosmos itself. And maybe I'll just leave it there, because there's so much more you could say about that, but the profundity of what we're describing is literally a shift in worldview, from a materialistic, mechanistic, disenchanted epistemology of the cosmos, the universe, towards an enchanted one, towards one that recognizes the numinous dimension within the world itself and within our being as well. So Yeah, much more to be said about that, but maybe that gives us a little template to start with.
Absolutely, and that's extremely exciting because I see that many of us are feeling. I think there's no person actually that's not feeling the shift. Indeed, we translate it in different ways, but I feel that that's a common understanding that there's something that is changing from the world that we knew, the normal, as we used to call it, right? The interesting thing would be to see with you today of what is that is happening connected to archetypal astrology practically, and where is it leading us? I know that from previous conversations that we had that the stars are always an indication. We don't know exactly what will happen, but we know the energetics behind a specific period of time, right? Mm-hmm. So did you see this whole period coming up? And how do you see it now being in it? And how do you see the next steps?
Really great question. So as far as anticipating the pandemic, I didn't specifically anticipate a pandemic. We did anticipate a contraction in history of some form from 2018 through 2021, which is the time period in which the two planets Saturn and Pluto were in a conjunction, which is the same place in the sky, like a new moon, like a solar eclipse is an exact conjunction of the moon and the sun. And this would be with the two planets Saturn and Pluto. And it takes Saturn 40 years to catch up with Pluto. So they make a conjunction every 40 years. There's squares and oppositions in between that are every 6 to 9 years, which are the quarterly hard dynamic aspects, which bring about a contraction in an event generally with the alignments. So just quickly, there was a conjunction in 1914, World War I. There was a square at the beginning of World War II in 1939. There was a conjunction at the end of World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War, 46 to 48, which you can see like World War I, the end of World War II. These are contractionary periods of power dynamic shifting contractions. 9/11 was our most recent opposition in between. There was a conjunction in 80 to 84, which is kind of the peak of the Cold War, and also the beginning of its end. Gorbachev is elected in 83, comes to power in 83 in Glasnost, and then it's basically falling apart in the late 80s. But, then we get the opposition in 2001, 2000 to 2001 with 9/11, and the contractionary historic moment that was. And then we have the conjunction here from 2018 to 21. Now, it is actually very interesting that in Cosmos and Psyche and Rick's evidentiary work, he recognized and points to the fact that the Black Plague that swept Europe in the 1348-50 period, it actually began in China during a Saturn-Pluto opposition in 1333. And then it was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1348 through 51 that the massive death took place in Europe of the Black Plague. I mean, it's much longer period than that, but it became concentrated. And the massive is Pluto. Plutonic is the id, the Freudian id, and it has extremely amount of depth and power and intensity to it, and it correlates to the masses. And Saturn is the Chronos, the father time, but also the Grim Reaper, and corresponds to mortality and the karmic consequences of our actions. But when the Saturn-Pluto combination comes together, you get an intensification, Pluto, of constricting forces and potentially mortality. And those are things that we recognize at other events. And this was clearly another intensification of contractionary energy that corresponded to a lot of suffering and death. So
that's fascinating. One question that is coming into my mind, and I would like to hear your approach to that. How is that possible that these cosmic conjunctions, the meeting of the planets and the cosmos, right, are affecting matter and are affecting us in a place that even creating death? Like, how do you see that connection? I would love to hear your approach to that.
Yes, and that's probably the most important stumbling block that the modern mind, materialistic modern mind, has a difficulty with. And this is where why I did a lot of research into quantum theory, is because the quantum physics now describes a universe that is probably best articulated as through entangled fields. There's an electron field, there's a boson field. You know, the boson field, it's a field. I mean, you call it a particle, but it's actually a field that vibrates at a certain frequency, at which when all of the other elementary particles inside of the atom interact with the Higgs field, is what it allows it to gain mass, allows those particles to gain mass. Just as one quick aside, but it's what we understand is that, or at least from my understanding of what physics is kind of moving towards, is an understanding of everything as being entangled, rather than entanglement being some rare phenomenon that only happens in cold, isolated temperatures. It's a fundamental aspect of nature, of the nature of reality, that there's an entangled relationship that permeates the entire cosmos, that nothing is actually separate in any fundamental way, and that there is likely a much more deeply enmeshed archetypal entanglement that runs through and through. So, or entanglement in general, and that the archetypes are a part of that process. So I don't know if that really addresses it completely, but basically, why the planets have this mysterious relationship to particular archetypes, I don't know. But the fact that they do is actually demonstrated in evidence. And that's where it's difficult, to describe it in a subjective way, or like a lot of the ways that criticism of astrology are that you're talking about the subjective experience inside of a person's psychology, or their, where they feel about themselves or know themselves. But the difference in the evidence in Cosmos and Psyche is that it's looking at cultural history. It's looking at broad sweeps of time. Like the French Revolution was a Uranus-Pluto decade. The 1960s was a Uranus-Pluto decade. We're not talking about any one person that is embodying or enacting those archetypal principles. We're talking about broad sweeps of culture doing it in many different ways. And that has a more objective dimension to it, because it's cultural history that's written about from many different perspectives, historical analyses that will all describe them with the language that is archetypally supportive of the planetary archetypes, or the understanding of the planetary archetypes that we recognize, if that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. And actually, I love that. One of the things that I love about your work is that you are bringing inside quantum physics, and you are bridging the two, because I feel that they're just a different language, particularly. And what's coming up as a question is like, how are the microcycles of a person experiencing what is happening now, and the macro cycles of a culture, of like a city, or maybe a nation, and maybe even all of us experiencing it? What would be the differences in those experiences, and how do they matter in the overall shaping of the field, let's say, together?
The differences of those experiences, you mean?
Between a person and between the collective.
Oh, okay. Well, it seems as though, I guess this is a good place to start. Our understanding, predominantly coming out of the modern materialistic mindset, is one of a subject-object division, that somehow the human subject is separate from the material world. Science itself is, the quest has been an effort to eliminate consciousness from our experience of the data. Like it's, they were striving to achieve a God's eye view, an objective, actual, truly objective perspective that sees the world in and of itself in its own way. This was actually not possible. It's not an error. It's not like the modern, it's just all a mistake. But what's actually happening is We are in a participatory relationship. When we look for particle, we see particle. When we look for wave, we see wave. That's a participatory relationship. The universe only shares itself with us relative to the questions we ask. So what's happening is there's a participatory relationship with everything that happens. And so when a person is born, the archetypal dynamics at that moment, at that time and place, is how one is participating in their incarnation into life at that moment. And this gets really complex, and you're most likely bringing in a lot of content from past lives, very possibly. But either way, you are an embodied participant of the archetypal dynamics at that moment in time, and you carry it through your life. And that's the way you participate. And then this is where astrology, the gift, the real benefit of astrology comes in, is not just the natal chart, but the planets continue to move as you evolve and grow and participate in life. And as you do that, when the planets make mathematical relationships back to where they were when you're born, it's a co-creative dynamic that you're enacting, that you're participating in. And I'll just back to my initial example, when Mercury was transiting in my natal Uranus, that happened to be the way that I participated in that transit at that time, in part because of the heightened state of awareness that I was in. But it was also just the way that my mind participated, or my being participated in that moment. And so, but nations also are doing the same thing in a sense. Like, so there is a birth chart for the United States, and it is how it is the essence of the collective being of the United States is actually participating in time. It's very interesting. The United States is 246 years old, roughly, and Pluto takes 246 years to go around once.
Great.
And so we're going, the United States is going through what's called its Pluto return. And Pluto is power and, intensity. And our dilemma as to whether we're going to continue on as a democracy or become a authoritarian, or really embrace that, is kind of up in the air right now. And there's a lot of shadow work that the United States is doing relative to its racist past, which is Pluto has a lot to do with the unconscious and what we repress. So we're collectively working through a lot of shadow material relative to our racist history and stuff. So is that helpful in the way
Absolutely.
that, like, it's a participatory relationship that everything is co-creatively enacting, in a sense. Alfred North Whitehead's process ontology, or process relational epistemology is a kind of a good scientific background for how how astrological phenomena may be scientifically understood, if that is helpful.
Totally, absolutely. And it brings actually the next question in my mind is like, what is coming next? What are the dynamics of what's coming next? And at the same time, it brings the question, how do we participate? It's almost like it cannot be one without the other. So it's not like, because many people, I think they have a kind of resistance about astrology because they feel that they will tell them exactly how is their future. And then the whole subject of free will is almost like collapsing there, which I don't feel is exactly that. And the way you describe it makes a lot of sense, because there's always a decision to be taken about how do you participate in the best way, practically. So guide me a bit. I personally feel that after New Year is like a new chapter. It's like turning the page of a book. That's how I have been describing it. It's like just turning the page. I have no idea what that really means. But I remember that before, in November 2019, I was feeling that there was a very big rupture in February 2020. And then we realized how it was. So usually I'm like, okay, probably there is something coming up. So I'm really, really curious of how do the stars look for the next period of time? And then we will see how we do participate in that. What the best way to participate.
Yes. Really great question. And this is the goal, like how do we best participate This is the practice. So the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is just ending technically. It's still kind of within orb. We use like a 15 to 20 degree orb for the conjunctions in particular. And it's leaving that orb relatively right now. So hopefully some of the real heavy, mass contractionary forces will abate on some level. But what we are in the middle of is a Saturn square Uranus period. And that corresponds to kind of a tug of war between the conservative Saturn traditional ways of knowing and Uranus's progress. It corresponds more to the myth of Prometheus, the archetype of Prometheus, the rebel trickster who is, rebelling against the traditional gods and wanting to have, for human progress. So this, dynamic between the progressive motions movement towards change versus the traditional racist white superiority, holding on to the traditional values is a big part of the dynamic struggle that's happening, at least relatively here in the United States. The Saturn square Uranus period, actually, there was a Saturn square Uranus alignment during the actual Civil War. So that's that type of like real shift or real struggle between the traditional forces and the movements of progress is happening. I think also I'm not as familiar with the details, but I believe the Russian Revolution in 1917, the second one, was also a Saturn Uranus period. But you can see it like in the mass resignation, the quitting, like a lot of divorces happening during Saturn Uranus because the impulse to just break free, to do your own thing, Uranus, against the constrictive forces of the marriage or whatever you feel stuck within. A lot of that dynamic is happening. People just wanting to break free of the past and have this new, a novel experience of themselves or the world. That energy is very ripe at the moment. Mm-hmm. And this will go on for another year or so. It's strongly through 2022, tapers off in 2023. And then we have a really supportive alignment, is a Uranus trine Pluto. So the trines are typically more harmonious. They're less dynamic. They're maybe less potent in a sense, but they have more confluence. There's a lot more of an easier exchange between the two. The last time we had Uranus and Pluto in a trine was the 1920s, when quantum theory and the roaring 20s, pushed off right before the Saturn Pluto actually was in opposition at the Great Depression, which I failed to mention earlier. So that contractionary period, mass suffering. But right before that was the Uranus trine Pluto, and quantum theory and everything came out of that. So I have a lot of hope in that sense. Yeah, I mean, of the potential technological transformations and psychological transformations that may be able to take place over the next, it runs from 2024 through the end of the decade, really through 2030, the Uranus trine Pluto. So potentially fusion energy, that's a holy grail for many decades now, but it would be archetypally fitting to have it quickly kind of, rapidly advance in the same way that quantum theory itself rapidly advanced and came to a conclusion in 1927, a conclusion, but a consolidation of understanding. So it may be possible that we have some really rapid technological transformations or psychological transformations that can render us a new worldview or render us a new mode of gaining energy or a new understanding of ourselves and nature. Clearly, this is just a kind of a parallel thing, but it's interesting that the James Webb Telescope just launched is going to, potentially see the very origins of the universe, of the cosmos itself. And in a sense, it's kind of what we're doing here as well. Like we're striving to reach back to the origins and I'll save that for later. I have one thing I wanted to say, but I'll say it in a minute.
There is one thing that's coming up from your last words, and this is, I was fascinated at some point that I read that practically as we progress and technology progress, we are able to see more and more planets, and that is actually shaping, or maybe we're only able to see planets when we are ready to also acquire the quality that these planets are representing somehow. So I'm wondering, like, I haven't caught up in the last planets we might discover. And it's super interesting just saying that we're trying to reach the levels, the extremes of our universe. What is the latest realization that came into our awareness because of what we saw in the cosmos?
Yeah, really good question. The planet Eris is the most recent discovery that we are taking seriously and recognizing potential very important archetypal patterns there. And that is, Eris was the goddess of strife and chaos in ancient Greece. And from my understanding, I mean, well, it's absolutely the case that the discovery of Eris is responsible for the demotion of Pluto as a planet. So right there, it's chaos and strife and discord just in the astronomical perspective of like what's actually technically a planet, you know. But it was discovered in 2003, right when we were going to war with Iraq and stuff, and like the heart of the terrorism, chaos and strife. I mean, as far as the war on terror, it is indicative of that in some level. And it's actually very true that the discovery of the other three outer planets corresponded with the whole century. Like this, Uranus is discovered in 1781, and it corresponds to, it's discovered right in between the American and French revolutions. And it corresponds to revolution and emancipation and the Enlightenment, breaking free of, you know, past traditions and gnosis, really like seeing the high picture. Then Neptune is discovered in 1846, and chemistry, because Neptune is the great mother goddess. It's our consciousness, it's love, it's the imagination ultimately, and it's the archetypal realm, and it's also compassion. And Neptune is everything that Saturn is not. Saturn is mortality and the physical world, our bones, the structure of things, the physical. And Neptune is consciousness. It's love. It's the things that you can't quantify. They're beyond physical qualification. And this 18th century has a lot of that energy in it. Then Pluto is discovered in between World War I and World War II at 1930 during the Great Depression, right at it. So that the power, the depth, the mass suffering and death, Pluto. So you can see the archetypal qualities surrounding the actual discoveries of the planets as well. So it does actually make sense potentially that Eris would be the next planetary body that we incorporate. And it also fits the lineage because basically all the planets are twice as far as the previous one. So Uranus is as far as Saturn. Neptune is about twice as far as Uranus, and Pluto is it's less than twice as far as Neptune. It actually catches up or it comes inside of Neptune's orbit at times. And this is part of why it was declassified as a planet. But Eris is actually 500 years, whereas Pluto is 246. It's twice as far as Pluto. So again, what we're talking about would be multi-generational aspects because it moves so slowly. It's not like, whereas the sun and the moon and Mars, Venus, and Jupiter even are much quicker, and they're much more personal as to how we embody them. The sun is the central part of our identity. The moon is the emotional, relational part of who we are. The sun more the striving, creative, dynamic, but they're very particular. They're very individual in that sense. Whereas the further you go out, the more transpersonal the archetypal energies of the planets themselves are.
I love that. It really, really correlates, I think, in our movement from the only personal individual space and more into the collective. And I feel that that's a lot, and the dynamics start changing anyhow when you go into the interpersonal, and then when you go into the bigger collective, and when you go into people you haven't even met, that we have reached this space right now. So I would love to hear what was coming up for you before, if you want to share it, if that feels like a good place to share it.
Sure, absolutely. I think, yeah. So what I was going to say is astrology, as the archetypal astrological perspective has emerged out of Rick and Stan's work, it has been primarily oriented around seen as an extension of depth psychology, as transpersonal psychology. And I guess, like, I think it is that, it definitely is that. It supports our understanding. I mean, honestly, it gives psychology an empirical ground that it doesn't possess as well without it. Like, the criticisms of psychology is that it's just talking, and you're not actually, I mean, it's subjective. There's no empirical way. There's no psychological school that's, definitively better than others. So it has this, like, ambiguous relationship within the sciences, in a sense, a soft science. But what the planetary alignments provide is an objective, empirical structure that allows us to make assessments relative to our perception, as to how we're perceiving the world, how we're enacting it, and it's reflective of the psychological complexes we already are identifying in psychology. So it has an empirical ground there. But the way we can understand archetypes is multidimensional. And Richard Tarnis is really, he's outlined a great way we can conceptualize them, in that we can understand them as Homeric gods and goddesses, as actual living beings. We can also recognize them as patterns, like psychological Jungian archetypes, as like complexes and patterns in the psyche. They can also be understood as mathematical forms, and just patterns in nature itself. But I think where I move towards, and what I was going to say before, is that I don't want to, like, it's hard because I don't want to come across as dogmatic, and I don't want to privilege any part of it on some level, like, but the fact that they are and can be understood as beings, as gods and goddesses, and the fact that what astrology does relative to the modern worldview is that it renders every human being as an important meaning center, that somehow the universe has an intentionality of focus and care, love for every individual, to allow us to have this connection to a transcendent source of meaning. And what it can provide is an actual relationship. As we follow our transits and get in touch with the archetypal complexes we have, and we're participating in time as the transits move on in our lives, the synchronicities that we experience relative to them them communicating to us. It's an act, and it's a reciprocal relationship. There's an intelligence that's paying attention to everyone. It's listening to everything we do. It's remembering everything we do. And then it reflects back to us the karmic consequences of those decisions ultimately. And those symbols, those signs, those synchronicities is a communication from the divine, ultimately, from the thou. And I guess that's the best way to describe what's taking place here, I think, is a transition from it relationship to the world to an I thou relationship. The materialistic, mechanistic worldview has projected, has rendered through projection ultimately a disenchanted materialism that has stripped away the depth that still exists with all phenomena. And we have, in an essence, to try and gain that God's eye view, the objective perception, tried to strip out our participation in it. And that's not possible. And the participation itself ultimately renders a relationship with the divine, with the creative intelligence in the universe, however you want to conceptualize it. There is an energy that's listening and paying attention and responding to the way we participate, or else it wouldn't work. Like we wouldn't be able to see transits supporting our experience. The only reason it does do that is because it's a genuine, authentic, they're real gods and goddesses. They're real beings that are listening and relating to us. And I guess here's another part of it is, a big part of this that led to, in philosophy, in the scientific revolution, is where Immanuel Kant said, you can't know the thing in and of itself. That there's this difference. We have our internal categories, and then there's outside. But what the astrological perspective says is that the internal categories are the same as what's outside. They're archetypal. The archetypal complexes within the human being are not other than the archetypes that we see in the cosmos itself. And that is a participatory relationship of knowing that's only possible because the archetypes are within as well as without. And that also is a way in which we are realizing our own divinity. We're resacralizing the cosmos, in essence, in that subtle shift, ultimately, from an I-it to an I-thou. And I think that is possible through and through. It's not just a part of reality that you do that with, it's all of it. And this is where I've just come across Iain McGilchrist's work. He's a psychiatrist, he's done a lot of neuroanatomy studies. And his hypothesis is that the left hemisphere, that the two hemispheres basically operate with different attention. And the left hemisphere has a narrow focused attention. The right hemisphere has a broad attention. The left hemisphere sees the part, the right sees the whole, sees the context, sees it as a continuum, whereas the left hemisphere is abstracting parts and objectifying the world ultimately. And this is where we can see that there's a way in which it's been our rendering of reality through the left hemisphere as to why we've objectified the world, in essence. And that there's a way in which just moving back towards more right hemisphere orientation, which is the body, art, metaphor, depth, all of those things we have to engage in more consciously to bring about more of a balance of hemisphere relationship. So yeah, I think that is also an important thing, because what's happening is we're not just describing, or McGilchrist is good about this, it's not that we are just going to incorporate this new knowledge and run with it from where we are. We have to change. Same way we're changing our understanding of the outer world, the inner world has to change as well. We have to change. And in McGilchrist's new book, which I haven't read yet, it's massive, but it's just released. But he's pointing towards Plotinus's question of it's like, who are we? Who is the human being? Who are we? And like, there's so many ways to think about this, but like the modern mechanistic worldview sees us as like the smart primate or something, with like, we're just in a random accident, and is that who we are? Is that the way we conceptualize ourselves? Or are we, just seeing a very limited understanding that's very surface, very, lacking the depth? And are we actually divine beings with this capacity to have a relationship with the creative intelligence that actually is making it possible? Like
I could comment so many things on what you said, really so many things. But I have been feeling that I have been sensing into this shift between the hemispheres myself when I was going into my quest, why I was born in Greece, for example, as a person. And then I realized that there is a shift that has been happening from Egypt to Greece, but I will leave that for another. That's a whole other conversation that I will be very happy if we make, actually, about how the civilizations were representing the rise and fall of civilization, how I was representing this psychic journey. But I really love that you're adding the layer, this double layer of how are we altering ourselves and we are seeing the world differently at the same time. And I feel that's exactly what's happening right now. It's who are we and who would like to be also. So like, who are we as how we were born or created, but also what are we aiming for as humanity? I feel that these questions are really, really coming up with everything that's happening. Everybody's taking choices, and these choices represent who we want to be, right? What is the future holding there for us? And I will just leave it there, because if we open this conversation today, we're not going to stop ever. It was so lovely. I mean, it's always so lovely. It was so lovely to catch up again and go into that conversation. I will be very happy if we keep it as something that happens when it has to come up. I will be very happy to discuss deeper in all of these concepts. You know that I love them personally. And just before we go, I would like to see if there is anything else that is coming through and wants to be expressed.
Let me take a look at my notes, because I did write down. Yeah. Let's see, we only have a few minutes. So yeah, I'll tie it up this way. In the epilogue to Passion of the Western Mind, in between Passion and Cosmos and Psyche, Rick describes what's called, he hypothesizes the post-Copernican double bind. Gregory Bateson described what's called the double bind in psychology, where like, I think it's like where a child has like a schizophrenic mother, and you desire love and relationship with the mother, and the mother may say something like a discordant thing where it's like, can't you tell that I love you? Or it's like there's a where the psyche is not matching the infant child, and it ultimately creates a schizophrenic type of mindset within the child. And Rick is pointing out that that's basically the modern condition in many ways, that the human subject is seeking meaning from the cosmos, but the mother is void, it's absent, it's not able to respond in kind, and it's creating a schizophrenic type mindset. McGilchrist is actually saying something very similar. He points out that psychopathology, sociopathy, psychopathy, and schizophrenia are right hemisphere deficit problems. They're left hemisphere overly dominant problems, and so it seems as though the modern worldview, in many ways, is becoming more and more schizophrenic. What's actually happening is we're deconstructing the biosphere, because we're pathological. Like, we're seeing it so much so that we see it as parts to be extracted and exploited. So there's a big thing there that, again, the astrological perspective can help heal that wound of needing a meaningful cosmos to relate to that can hold space for us ultimately. And that's what it does. And then what McGilchrist is suggesting, our way out of the situation is through the body, through art, through music, through empathy and relationship. But he's also saying that science, reason, which not rationality, but reason and intuition and the imagination are the way out. Because it's not like we're just going to throw science out, which is, a largely left hemisphere process. But we need it.
Right?
It's a balance, but you have to incorporate intuition and imagination. And this is ultimately what archetypal practice is. Like when you're engaging with the archetypes, it requires intuition and the imagination and science, which is the empirical aspect of it, the mathematical structure of the birth chart and the solar system. So we have a scientific dimension of the astrological perspective, but it requires intuition and the imagination and reason in a complex, holistic way to really engage with the phenomena, to have the shift take place, to engage in the practice. Yeah, I feel like there was one more thing I wanted to say.
For you describing now, it really brings into my mind at some point it was coming as a feeling, as an inner understanding for my own journey, that science made me understand the world, and then spirituality made me find my place in this world.
Yes.
Exactly. Otherwise you're understanding it, but you don't know what you're doing there, or you know what you're doing there, but you don't understand what's happening, and both can be frightening somehow for the psyche.
Right. Yes, exactly. So yeah, it's a holistic movement. Like Aristotle said, you don't understand something until you understand all its causes. And he means like formal cause and final cause, as well as efficient and material cause. We're just caught in the efficient material world. Like we're not even thinking formal and final. But the astrological, it provides that. It gives us an access to formal and final causation. And that's what you're describing. The spiritual dimension is that relationship of depth, of meaning that transcends the material efficient causal dimension, that rocks or grounds the whole in a more comprehensive knowing, a wisdom, knowledge that requires formal and final causation, which ultimately the astrological perspective can intimate towards a telos, an actual telos of where the human being species is moving towards, hopefully not annihilation and biosphere destruction through objectification, and exploitation, but a deepening, like in a Goetherian way, Goethe, like of engaging with the numinous dimension of the natural world and recognizing it as such. And astrology makes the planets numinous, like it actually secularizes everything in the right perspective. But yeah, it can provide a new worldview ultimately from which we can move that is much more harmonious and sustainable ultimately, potentially. So
for sure, way more broad than the one that we have been given. So I think that's already a step that humanity is willing and is taking right now. There's like including much more complexity, but without creating confusion in the mind, more like an understanding of how all the dynamics are working together. And
exactly
or the other.
Yes. I guess this will be the last thing I say. Like I've tried to give that a term, to term it on some level, and I'm working off of Robert Bella's conception of second order thinking, which he describes as emerging in ancient Greece, like basically formal logic, like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, that emerges in ancient Greece, and it's the emergence of critical self-reflection, like in the axial period of religion, basically. And at that period, well, what's important about it is that that's what we've been working with, second order thinking, basically since then. And the astrological perspective provides the capacity for maybe something called third order thinking, where we're engaging our critical self-reflective capacities, but we're engaging them with the archetypes that are informing our thoughts. Like it's informing our being. And it's a new level of awareness that provides a new capacity where instead of being unconscious embodiments or participating unconsciously with their energies, it's the potential to move into a conscious co-creative relationship with them. And that requires it is another level of thinking. It requires a different level of imagination and relationship with the energies that are part of forming our experience.
Absolutely.
Anyway, yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
and I love that. I love that you're bringing that as the last piece, because I feel that's exactly where human beings are growing towards. We're evolving towards being able to hold and create that. Sometimes I love to believe that in every single moment we have been doing the best that we can with the consciousness that we had in that particular moment. And I feel that we keep evolving together with it and understanding more, and then acting differently, and then learning more. It's this constant dance with the planet and with everything. So thank you so much for today. It was amazing as always. I would really love to go into the second exploration about the civilization, because it's something that really, really inspires me personally in another time.
I would love to do that.
Until then, I just wish you a beautiful day there. I think it's still in the morning. And thank you so much for bringing all of that knowledge, wisdom, study, but also your inner being and essence into that, because I know how much of, even though you refer to many people, I know that many of what you're saying, it's also very original. And I would just like to honor that. And thank you for that. And just keep bringing that on, because we're extremely interested.
Thank you so much, Leaky. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. It was a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.
Likewise.
Bye. I will unfortunately have to go because I have another meeting, but it was so wonderful.
Absolutely.
Definitely would love us to, let me